any revolution, really, or any rebellion is more about domestic grievances than it is about foreign policy issues. But it sort of misses the point in the sense that it's not accurate to say that Israel-Palestine issue on the one hand and attitudes towards the U.S. had nothing at all to do with the Egyptian uprising. Actually, throughout the 2000s, there was a considerable amount of activity happening at the popular level. There was a lot of discontent, certainly towards, for domestic reasons. There was a very active labor movement. All of these groups that came together eventually on January 25th, 2011 to launch the uprising. They had been percolating for quite a few years. Among the issues that were really animating Egyptian policy during that period was very intense, or at least intensified, pro-Palestinian activism, and that sort of went hand in hand with anti-Israeli activism, as well as anti-American sentiment in response to both its support for Israel and the Iraq War. That was big after 2003, after the invasion of Iraq. So a lot of the activism, it's one of the few areas that the Mubarak regime actually tolerated expressions of discontent by the Egyptian public. It was a sort of a pressure valve that they could turn on and off, as long as the sentiment was never directed at the regime itself. And so in a way, these groups, a lot of these same groups that were organizing Palestine solidarity activities and anti-American protests, a lot of these same groups were involved in the January 25th uprising. The real important changes have been the rise in populist sentiment, which gets translated into mainly anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, anti-American sentiment, and the situation on the ground. There's been a real security vacuum, for example, in the Sinai Peninsula between Egypt and Israel, which is a major source of concern for Israel. There have been a number of attacks that have been launched from the Sinai onto Israeli soil. There have been Israeli casualties. There have been Israeli reactions in the Sinai, which has put Egyptians at very ill at ease, because it's seen as a violation of Egyptian sovereignty, but it's also, there were Egyptian casualties, and so there was a sense of victimization. And given this wellspring of anti-Israel sentiment, it was potentially very kind of explosive situation. At the same time, we've seen the gas pipeline, for example, between Egypt and Israel that delivers Egyptian natural gas to Israel has been bombed something like 17 times since Mubarak stepped down a year and a half ago. Most recently, we had attacks, very dramatic attack on Egyptian military based in the Sinai, killing 15 or 16 border guards or military personnel. And since then, that was a few days ago, since then we've seen a major operation apparently happening in the Sinai by the military in response, where they are presumably cracking down on these extremist elements. The most important change, and the one that will probably be the hardest to roll back, is the increased importance of public opinion. And so even though the military is still mostly in charge of foreign policy, including the intelligence apparatus, it is impossible for any future Egyptian government to completely ignore Egyptian public sentiment the way Mubarak did. And so that will have an impact. There are a couple of reasons why I think we're not likely to see dramatic changes in Egyptian policy, at least over the short and medium term. The first is that Egyptians are simply too consumed with domestic affairs and domestic issues. You have serious economic crisis, you have security vacuum in some parts of the country, you've got major impatience with this transition that has gone terribly wrong at almost every turn for 18 months, and a great deal of impatience on the part of ordinary Egyptians, and they simply don't have the bandwidth to deal with foreign policy. And another reason is that there is fairly broad consensus across the political and ideological spectrum in Egypt on most foreign policy issues, and particularly when it comes to Israel-Palestine. The third reason is one that we talked about a little bit, which is that the military is still basically in control of Egyptian foreign policy. And so there might be some pressures by political parties, by the parliament, even by the president, public opinion, in a certain direction. But as far as the decision makers, it is still the military and the intelligence apparatus that is making those key decisions. And we're seeing that playing out right now in the Sinai. I think as far as Egypt's traditional role in the so-called peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, which of course at this point doesn't exist, so there's no reason to expect to see a major Egyptian role. But to the extent that Egypt is involved, it is going to most likely be involved on the Palestinian side in trying to heal the rift between the two rival factions, Hamas and Fatah, to try and bring them back together in some sort of reconciliation arrangement. So we're not likely to see Egyptian involvement in the peace process per se, but more of a focus on internal Palestinian unity.